Commissioners, we'll next hear from the Child Migrants Trust. Thank you. Now, Dr. Margaret Humphreys, you're the International Director of the Trust.
Yes, I am.
Is that right? And Mr. Thwaites, you're the Assistant Director.
That's right.
Thank you. Can I invite you to speak to your submission?
Yes, of course. I've prepared just, I think, probably about 8 minutes introduction to our submission, which deals with some of the issues that we've included in the written submission.
You should be assured that all of the written submissions have been read by the Commissioners.
Okay, right, thank you. I thought today that I would focus on the federal government's responsibility to former child migrants. So I intend to underline the federal government's specific and special responsibilities towards former child migrants in support of the arguments for a national redress scheme. Just a small piece of history about child migration. It's very short, but child migration was government policy, both for Britain and Australia. It was known as the Commonwealth Child Migration Schemes. The children, some as young as 4 years of age, it seems were part of Australia's post-war defence under the populate or perish policy to boost Australia's population and deter any foreign invasion. It's hard for us to get our heads around that now, but I feel it's important to make that point. The former Immigration Minister, Arthur Colwell, requested 50,000 children from the United Kingdom during the first 3 post-war years. Former child migrant circumstances are quite different from other groups. First, on their arrival in Australia, their legal guardian was the federal government. Although delegated to the states and in turn subcontracted to various institutions, former child migrants remained the responsibility of the federal government that had authorised, in a sense, their removal to this country. Individual assessment and approval for the migration of each child was carried out through the Australia House in London. Continuing responsibility was acknowledged by payment of subsidies for each child until their 15th birthday. Well, that is the clear historical case. Post-war child migration was a federal initiative. Obviously, 4-year-old children didn't decide to come to Australia themselves. The intentions apparently seemed good at the time. But for the majority of child migrants, the road to hell was paved with good intentions. In relation to former child migrants, post-apology issues of redress and restitution, for the most part, remain the responsibility of Commonwealth governments. We cannot stand by, it seems to me, at this important stage and see governments fail to accept their responsibility to Britain's child migrants, former child migrants and their families. Administrations change and policies dating from 70 years ago seem hard to understand within a more humane society today. But there are compelling arguments for the federal government to accept responsibility for child migration and all its devastating consequences for those children, now adults. Yet child migrants live every day with the painful consequences of past failures of government in its duty of care to protect young, vulnerable children in this particular case, another country's children. There was a monumental failure to keep them safe. This was acknowledged in both the apology of the Australian government in 2009, followed by the detailed apology delivered by Gordon Brown in 2010. Now, most former child migrants, or those I've spoken to and my colleague as well, would say the federal government failed to protect them, to carry out their responsibilities as an effective guardian. They have paid a heavy price for this neglect all their lives. There was a failure to make provision for the children to be granted citizenship. Indeed, many former child migrants were here 50 years before learning they were not citizens. The national apology in 2009 was a key milestone in this country's history of taking responsibility for children in care and acknowledging the terrible long-term impact of systemic failures to protect children from abuse. Australia, like the United Kingdom, has since taken positive steps to improve the lives of former child migrants by funding, for example, the Child Migrants Trust Specialist Service and cultural initiatives to ensure a better public understanding of their experience of child migration, but more needs to be done. Globally, there is a growing movement to address issues of historical abuse, a welcome acknowledgement that nations must face their past rather than continue a damaging pattern of denial and avoidance of responsibility. Other countries such as Canada and Ireland have seen their national apology as an important starting point in delivering truth and justice to its most vulnerable citizens. Sadly, decades of denial have compounded the original harm and need to be factored into any redress claim. We must begin to get to grips with some new concepts. For example, secondary abuse. We need more recognition of secondary abuse. In everyday speech, we acknowledge that insult can add to injury. Previous redress initiatives by governments and institutions have produced a patchwork response which many child migrants have experienced as discriminatory and unfair. It is one of the strongest arguments for a national redress scheme. Similarly, if redress provision is constructed like an obstacle course with complex processes, then we should not expect positive results. We certainly shouldn't expect a sense of healing or justice to emerge from complex processes. There is a clear need to act quickly for child migrants and to avoid leaving them with a legacy of bitterness and betrayal which will be inherited by their children. Time is not on the side of child migrants. We need to clear the roadblocks to justice a little more quickly. When I first came to Australia and worked with former child migrants back in 1988, I raised with both the Australian and British governments the disclosure by many child migrants of childhood abuse. I have done this yearly since, every year. The immediate response from various organisations was to argue that this was the standards of the day. My response at that time, in 1988, was to ask, when was it lawful to assault children? Your Honour, we have moved a considerable way forward since then in our understanding of childhood sexual abuse in all its many forms and its consequences, which are lifelong. Your consultation paper is asking all of us to determine the standards of today.
Thank you very much. Your timing was impeccable, Dr. Humphries.
Thank you, Dr. Humphries, and thank you for coming on a long journey, which I know you've made many times, to be here today. There's only one issue that I want to take up with you, and that is this question which you may not be able to help us with, but you know that the law in England has changed in relation to the liability of the institution for the abuse of the child. Do you know anything about whether or not that's led to more people suing institutions in England?
I don't really know the answer to that. There's a whole complex argument at the moment about historical abuse in England, as there is here. I can't answer that.
Yes, in fact, you're about.
I don't know whether you can.
It's an issue of vicarious liability, I think.
Yeah.
Yes.
About,
Yeah. But you can't help with knowing what the English. No, we've set in train some approaches to try and find out, but it's obviously a significant issue. And that's the second thing. I think you are about to have an English inquiry into these issues. Is that right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Yes, it's been very complicated, but I think they've appointed a judge in the UK to look at historical abuse in children's homes and elsewhere in the UK.
Is that the New Zealand judge?
Yes, it is. Yes.
Yeah. Thank you.
Can I ask this question? You've now been working on seeking not only a national apology, which you achieved, but also national redress for some time. You're now faced again with our consultation paper, which proposes, as one of the options, a national redress scheme. Given your intimate knowledge of the Commonwealth Government and its response to your requests, what do you think is the single greatest barrier that has prevented a national scheme being established to provide redress for members of your community that are being abused?
Well, of course, denial is a great thing, isn't it? And the journey of child migration for the last, 30 years has been one of denial, and particularly at a government level. So we are moving, I hope, out of denial. I've laid out, really, the case in relation to child migrants and the responsibilities of the federal government in relation to child migrants. I'm really not sure what the barrier is, unless it's one of economics and precedence.
Thank you.
I have a question to you, please, Dr. Humphreys. Central to your work has been the link between family restoration, access to records, therapy, counselling, that sort of thing. And through the Senate and through your own efforts, both the Commonwealth and the British governments have made some redress efforts by funding reconnection to family, and that's been important. There's a whole category of people who have been subject to child sexual abuse in institutions, which are larger than child migrants, but which have similar family restoration needs. And I would name them as including child migrants, the stolen generation, wards of state generally, and those in foster care. Very frequently they come from a fractured or difficult family environment. With your background and experience, how should the Royal Commission consider formally including that body of concern for some quite large populations in our redress proposals?
I think what we all want is recovery for people, isn't it? We want recovery. What does recovery come from? Identity, belonging, knowing who you belong to. They're very important strands in recovery. Specialist services for people who have been separated from family and been in care or in foster care requires specialist skills. Independent services for both the child, now an adult, and the family, and the extended family. I think the work of the Trust over 30 years really demonstrates that families can actually meet and re-establish or establish relationships and belonging for the first time. With child migrants, it's after 50 years. It's often with mothers and sometimes fathers who were told their children were dead. And yet the outcomes, hence the Family Restoration Fund from the British government, which was about how can we help positively? What are the practical initiatives that are required to bring about family reunions that has meaning? Well, it's not meeting just once. You need to build on that. What are the key components? Skilled, qualified workers. Work with all parts of the family. Not just one part, all parts of the family, wherever they are. Wherever they are. Distance must not be the problem if we want good outcomes and recovery.
And would you consider that attention, and I might describe it under our related matters in terms of reference, as falling into what we would describe as the institutional response stream, or what we would describe as the therapy stream of redress?
I think it's both.
I think the probably most significant issue about it is that if there was to be any fund to support family reunion work for other groups, that it needs to be provided, as Margaret said, within professional services to ensure it's not wasted, to ensure that it's targeted and that people are able to take the greatest opportunities available to them.
I'm not sure, does that answer the question where it falls? Because it probably falls into both categories, actually.
I could engage you for a long time, but no, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Your Honour. I have no further questions.
Thank you both for coming, and again, Dr. Humphries, for travelling so far. And thank you for the contributions you've made to the Commission's work. Thank you.
Thank you.